Normandy, July of 1944. To understand what happened in the Hedgerow country that summer, begin with a scene that played out, in one form or another, thousands of times across the American front. Picture a German machine gunner of the 352nd Infantry Division, settled into the base of an earthen bank somewhere south of the town of St. Lo. Behind him stands a wall of soil and root that has stood in that exact spot since before the Norman conquest of England. His weapon is an MG-42, a gun capable of firing 1,200 rounds every minute, and it is sighted diagonally across the small field in front of him. A second gun waits at the far corner, angled to catch anything that enters from the other side. Between the two of them, no man can cross that field and live. He has done this before, in the field behind him, and in the field behind that one. Each time, the Americans came. Each time, the crossfire stopped them. And each time, the German gunners slipped backward to the next bank and began again. This is the arithmetic of the bocage, and for 6 weeks it has favored the defender so completely that it has begun to feel less like combat than like a law of nature. A defender in that position knew exactly where the danger would come from. It would come from the gap in the far hedge, or from the sunken lane to the flank, or from the gate where the cattle once passed. Those were the doors into the field, and every door was covered. The entire German understanding of this battle rested on a single assumption so obvious that almost no one in their army had thought to question it. Tanks could not pass through the hedgerows. They could only go around them, through the openings, and the openings were death. And then, on a morning near the end of July, for men in positions exactly like this one, the wall itself began to move. Not the gap, not the lane, not the gate. The bank directly in front of them, 6 feet of packed earth and centuries of tangled root, split open with a sound like the world tearing, and the blunt steel snout of a Sherman tank punched straight through the middle of it, throwing dirt and branches across the field, its gun already level, already turning. There had been no door there. There could be no door there. The thing that German defensive doctrine had declared impossible was suddenly happening, and in the instant it took a man to understand that his deepest assumption had been wrong. The assumption had already killed him. This is the puzzle at the center of the Normandy breakout, and it is easy to state and hard to explain. For most of 2 months, the German defense of the Hedgerow country was one of the most successful defensive campaigns of the entire war in the West. A numerically inferior force, often outnumbered and almost always outgunned, held the finest army the United States had ever put into the field to an advance measured in yards per day and paid for in appalling numbers of dead. The terrain did most of the work, and then, in the last week of July, the same terrain, defended by the same kind of soldiers, in the same kind of positions, simply stopped working. The doors that had been impassable were everywhere now. The walls were no longer walls. The popular answer to how this happened is a piece of welded scrap steel bolted to the front of a tank, invented by an American sergeant. It is a wonderful story. It is also, as we will see, only part of the truth, and the part that has been most exaggerated in the telling. The real answer is larger and stranger than the story of one clever device. But to understand why the hedgerows stopped protecting the men who hid behind them, you first have to understand just how good those hedgerows were. Because the terrain deserves to be taken seriously. It is the easiest part of this story to underestimate. The word for this country is bocage, and it describes a landscape that had been accumulating its defenses for something like 2,000 years. When Norman farmers cleared these fields, they piled the stones and the earth along the boundaries of each small plot, and over the centuries those piles grew into banks. Hedges took root along the tops of the banks, and the roots grew down into the soil and bound it together, and generation after generation the banks grew taller and thicker and more solid, until they were no longer piles of dirt, but ramparts. Some stood only 3 feet high, others rose as much as 15 feet, once the vegetation on top was counted. Some were a single stride thick, and some were wide enough to drive along. Between adjacent banks ran narrow lanes, sunken below the level of the fields by centuries of erosion and cartwheels, and in many places the hedges arched over these lanes from both sides and met in the middle, so that a man walking them moved through a green tunnel, blind to anything more than a few feet beyond the walls. Each field enclosed by these banks was small, sometimes only 100 feet across, rarely more than a few hundred yards on a side. From the air, the American planners who studied the reconnaissance photographs saw a patchwork, thousands of tiny irregular enclosures stitched together by the dark lines of the hedges. What they did not fully grasp, until men were dying in it, was that they were looking at a natural fortress with thousands of individual compartments. Each one was a separate defensive position. Each one required its own separate attack. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the American First Army through this fighting, called it the damnedest country he had ever seen. One American battalion commander put the failure of preparation more bitterly. His men, he said, had rehearsed endlessly for the assault on the beaches, and not one single day had been given to the country that lay behind them. The Germans did not build the bocage, and they had not originally planned to make their stand in it. But as the Allies spent the weeks after the landings grinding toward the port of Cherbourg, the German commanders looked at this terrain and understood what it offered them, and they organized it into a defense in depth, with a professional thoroughness that turned an accident of agriculture into a military instrument. Consider what a single defended field looked like from the American side of the bank. The defenders were dug into the base of the hedgerow itself, tunneled into the earth with only narrow firing slits facing outward, protected overhead by the roots and the soil from the airbursts of American artillery, which tended to detonate harmlessly in the treetops. Machine guns sat at diagonal corners so their fire crossed in the middle of the field, and any infantry entering that field walked into an interlocking beaten zone from which there was no cover. The German machine gun, the MG-42, fired more than twice as fast as its American counterpart, a ripping, tearing sound that men who survived it never forgot. Mortars, sighted in advance on the gaps and the lanes and the likely approach routes, waited behind the front line to drop shells on any attacker who went to ground. Anti-tank guns and the shoulder-fired Panzerfaust covered the openings, the gates, and the sunken roads, precisely the places a vehicle would have to use. And the defense was elastic. It was not designed to hold every field to the last man. It was designed to make the Americans pay a heavy price for each field, and then to slip away to the next one before the price could be collected in prisoners. A thin screen of defenders on one bank would halt an American company, bleed it, and then withdraw through the concealment of the hedges to the next bank 100 feet back, where the whole lethal arithmetic would begin again. The American infantry would fight through one field, exhausted and bloodied, only to find an identical problem waiting immediately beyond it. There were, in the American sector of Normandy, thousands of these fields. It matters who these German defenders actually were, because the popular memory of Normandy tends to imagine a broken enemy simply waiting to be swept aside, and the truth in July was very different. The whole American sector was the responsibility of a single German formation, the 84th Corps, commanded through most of this period by General Dietrich von Choltitz. Above him stood the German 7th Army, taken over in late June by Paul Hauser, the first officer of the Waffen-SS ever to command a field army, after the previous commander died suddenly at the end of the month. These were serious men running a serious defense. The division holding the ground around Saint-Lô, the 352nd Infantry Division, was the same formation that had inflicted such slaughter on the American landing at Omaha Beach a month earlier. Its commander was General Dietrich Kreis, a capable and respected officer. But by the first week of July, his division had been fought almost to nothing. Where it had once fielded a full complement of regiments, the American official history records its surviving strength as a battle group of only about 800 men. By the end of the month it would be declared, in the flat language of the German army, fought out, no longer fit for combat, its remnants folded into scratch formations. Kreis himself would be mortally wounded on the 4th of August and die 2 days later. The division that had held Omaha died holding the Hedgerows. Alongside it stood a very different kind of enemy, and a far more dangerous one. The 3rd Parachute Division, the German Fallschirmjäger, had arrived from Brittany in June, nearly 16,000 strong, and it was among the finest infantry formations the Germans had in Normandy. It was lavishly equipped with automatic weapons, so heavily supplied with machine guns that a single one of its companies could put out several times the volume of fire of the American company attacking it. These paratroopers held the high ground east of Saint-Lô, and they would make the Americans pay for every foot of it. So when the histories call the Hedgerow fighting slow and costly, keep this in mind. In places, the Americans were not grinding down a beaten remnant at all. They were up against some of the best light infantry in the world, dug into the best defensive terrain in France. There was one more fact about the German dispositions that would prove decisive, though no one in the Hedgerows could see it at the time. The bulk of the German armor, the panzer divisions that were the real striking power of the German army in the West, was not in the American sector at all. It was concentrated far to the east, around the city of Caen, locked in a separate and ferocious battle with the British and the Canadians. We will come back to why that mattered so much. For now, hold on to the shape of it. The Americans in the bocage faced superb infantry and very little armor, and the reason for that imbalance was being decided 60 miles away. If stories like this one matter to you, the forgotten engineering and the hard tactical problems behind what actually happened in combat, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach the people who care about getting it right. The cost of this fighting is difficult to state with precision, and anyone who gives you a single clean number is simplifying something that resists simplification. The record does not neatly separate Hedgerow casualties from the broader totals of the Normandy campaign, but the shape of it is clear enough. By early July, the Allied armies together had suffered well over 60,000 casualties since the landings, with close to 9,000 dead. Individual American units were gutted. In one regiment, a single rifle company lost roughly 9 of every 10 of the men it had started with in the space of 3 weeks. Rifle companies that had come ashore near full strength, 150 men or more, were worn down to 60. The fighting had the grinding, attritional character of the previous World War, not the sweeping mobility that American commanders had trained and equipped their army to achieve. The men in the fields began, grimly, to describe the price in terms of ground. 1 dead American, some said, for every hedgerow. Now understand the specific problem the tanks faced, because this is the mechanical heart of the whole story. The American army in Normandy had more tanks than it could effectively use, and in open country a Sherman was a war-winning weapon. But the bocage was the opposite of open country. A tank that came up against one of these earthen banks could not simply drive through it. The bank was too high and too solid. So the tank had to climb, nosing up the face of the bank, and at the moment it reached the top 2, catastrophic things happened at once. The first was that as the tank tilted its nose toward the sky to climb, its main gun and its machine guns pointed uselessly upward, unable to fire at anything on the ground. For those seconds, the tank was blind and toothless. The second was far worse. As the tank reared up onto the bank, it exposed its belly, the thinnest and most weakly armored surface on the entire vehicle, no more than about an inch of steel, to anything waiting on the far side. The alternative to climbing was to stay on the roads and in the sunken lanes, but those were exactly where the anti-tank guns and the mines were waiting, and a tank in a lane could not turn, could not maneuver, and often could not even reverse quickly. The bocage had, in effect, disarmed the single greatest advantage the American army possessed. It took the tank, an instrument of speed and shock, and turned it into a slow, blind, vulnerable box. To understand how deadly that vulnerability was, you have to understand what was waiting on the other side of the bank. The German soldier in the bocage did not need a tank of his own to kill an American one. He had the Panzerfaust, a cheap, single-use launcher that fired an oversized shaped charge warhead, and though it was accurate only at very short range, 30 to 60 meters at most, in the Hedgerows almost every range was short. A hidden man with one of these could burn out any Allied tank ever built with a single shot straight into that exposed floor. He had the reusable rocket launcher the Germans had copied and improved from the American bazooka, deadly out to a little further. He had the towed 75mm anti-tank gun, low and hard to see, able to punch through the front of a Sherman across the length of a field. And where the German armor was present, he had the 88mm gun that could kill a tank at well over a mile, and the low, flat assault gun that sat so close to the ground it was often spotted only after it had already fired. Against dug-in Panthers and Tigers, the Sherman's own gun could not even reliably penetrate the front plate at normal combat range. The tank crews knew all of this. They knew that to climb a hedgerow was to offer their belly to a man they could not see. They also knew something grimmer about the machine they rode in. The Sherman had a hard-won reputation for catching fire when its armor was pierced. British studies after the campaign found that a Sherman which was penetrated burned in the great majority of cases, often before the crew could scramble clear, and the men inside were painfully aware of the odds. Later modifications to the way the ammunition was stored would reduce the danger, but in the summer of 1944, a tanker facing a hedgerow was weighing his own life against every foot of ground. And so, understandably, they were cautious. And caution in the bocage meant slowness. And slowness meant the infantry too often went forward without them. Why were the Germans given the time to perfect all this? Because the first great Allied prize after the landings was not a breakout to the south, but a port. The invasion beaches could not by themselves supply the enormous armies now piling into Normandy, and the Allied plan depended on capturing the deep-water harbour at Cherbourg, at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula. So for much of June, the American effort drove north and west toward that port, rather than south into open country. Cherbourg fell at the end of June, but the Germans had wrecked its harbour so thoroughly that it would be weeks before it could carry the traffic the Allies needed. The campaign for the port bought the German defenders in the bocage precious time to dig in, and it left the Allied commanders under a quiet, mounting pressure. They had vast forces still waiting in England with nowhere to deploy, a supply line strained by the ruined harbour, and a beachhead that was not expanding fast enough. Every week the front stayed frozen was a week the whole design of the campaign hung in doubt. The hedgerows were not just costing lives, they were threatening the timetable of the war in the West. There was a further problem, less visible but just as damaging, and it lay in the relationship between the tanks and the infantry they were supposed to support. When the fighting began in Normandy, an American infantryman on the ground had almost no way to talk to the crew of a buttoned-up tank a few feet away from him. The tankers were sealed inside steel, half deaf from the engine and the guns, seeing the world through narrow vision slits. The infantry could see the German positions the tankers could not, and had no means of telling them. A soldier who wanted to direct a tank's fire onto a particular hedgerow might have to climb onto the vehicle under fire and bang on the hatch with his rifle butt. In terrain where the enemy was often invisible until he fired, this failure of communication was itself lethal. The two arms that were supposed to protect each other fought, in the early weeks, almost as strangers. So this was the situation by the middle of July, a landscape purpose-built for defense, though no one had built it for that. A German defender who held every advantage the terrain could give. An American tank force whose central strength had been neutralized, and a rate of advance so slow against losses so heavy that some at the highest levels of Allied command had begun to worry in private that the front might congeal into the kind of stalemate their fathers had known in the trenches 30 years before. The men who suffered most from this were not poorly trained or poorly led. They were the soldiers of a superbly equipped modern army, doing everything their doctrine told them to do, and it was not working, because their doctrine had been written for a different kind of war than the one the hedgerows imposed. Hold on to this, because it is the key to the whole puzzle. The Americans were not losing the hedgerow fight because they were bad at it. They were losing it because the terrain had changed the rules, and the side that first found a way to change them back would win. The change, when it came, did not arrive from the top of the army as a grand plan. It bubbled up from the bottom, from the men actually stuck in the fields, and it took the form of dozens of separate, improvised, unglamorous experiments happening across the American front at roughly the same time, most of them unaware of each other. This is the part of the story that the neat legend tends to erase. There was no single flash of genius from one man that unlocked the bocage. There was an entire army full of frustrated, practical, mechanically minded soldiers, and when you put enough such men against the same problem, some of them begin to find answers. The most important answers were not about machinery at all. They were about teamwork. Before any welded gadget appeared, American units in the last days of June and the first days of July had begun working out how to make tanks, infantry, and engineers fight as a single coordinated body against a single hedgerow. The first and simplest fix solved the communication problem. Someone had the idea of taking an ordinary field telephone, the kind wired to a handset, and mounting it in an empty ammunition box bolted to the rear of the tank, wired straight into the tank's own intercom. Now an infantryman walking behind the tank, shielded by its bulk, could pick up the handset and talk directly to the crew inside, pointing them at targets they could never have seen on their own. This deceptively small innovation is often credited to a tank battalion supporting the 30th Infantry Division, though the official histories are careful to spread the credit more broadly across many units of the First Army who arrived at similar solutions at the same time. However it began, it spread fast, and it transformed the tank from a deaf and blinded animal into a weapon the infantry could aim. With communication solved, the tactics followed. In the 29th Infantry Division, under the close personal supervision of Brigadier General Norman Cotter, a hard-bitten officer who had walked the sands of Omaha Beach on the first morning, whole units pulled back into quiet fields near the village of Couvains and rehearsed a new kind of attack over and over until it became second nature. The method was a piece of choreography. An assault team was built around one infantry squad, one Sherman tank, and a squad of combat engineers carrying explosive charges. The team moved on a single field as a unit. The tank would nose up to the near bank and rake the far corners of the field with machine gun fire, hosing down the hidden German positions and forcing their heads down. Under that covering fire, the engineers rushed forward and packed demolition charges against the base of the bank, or into holes that a tank had already bored, and blew a gap. The tank pushed through the fresh gap, and the infantry surged across the open middle of the field, deliberately crossing the center rather than hugging the sides, because the sides were where the enfilading machine guns were sighted. Two engineers stayed close to the tank the whole time, watching the flanking hedges for German soldiers with Panzerfausts. Field by field, this was the answer. It was not glamorous, it did not have a name that would echo down the decades, but it worked, and it was worked out by ordinary units teaching themselves under fire. The clearest proof that the new tactics could break even the best German defense came on the 11th of July, at a piece of high ground east of Saint-Lô, known only by its height in meters, Hill 192. It was the dominant terrain feature of the whole sector, and from its crest, German observers could see across the American lines almost to the invasion beaches. Twice in June, it had thrown back attacks by the 2nd Infantry Division and swallowed grievous casualties. The defenders were the elite paratroopers of the 3rd Parachute Division, dug into the banks with all their machine guns. When the 2nd Infantry Division came again on the 11th of July, under Major General Walter Robertson, it came with everything the army had learned. The attack was spearheaded by the 38th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Ralph Zwicker, tightly bound to its supporting tanks and engineers, and it was preceded and accompanied by a colossal weight of artillery, keyed to a grid of numbered squares so that fire could be shifted forward, field by field, as the infantry advanced. The gunners fired many thousands of rounds in support of that single attack. By around midday the hill was taken. The paratroopers who had held it so long were killed, captured or driven off, and the American army had shown, on the ground, that the bocage could be systematically taken apart by a team that knew its business. It cost the 2nd Division well over 1,000 men to prove it. The larger battle for Saint-Lô itself gave the campaign its most enduring human image, and it belonged not to a machine, but to a man. As the 29th and 35th Infantry Divisions ground their way toward the town through the ridges and hedgerows, one of the battalion commanders leading the 29th was Major Thomas Howie, a schoolteacher in civilian life who had come to soldiering by way of a military college in the American South. On the 17th of July, his battalion broke through to relieve another that had been cut off. and when his division commander asked whether his exhausted men could push on into Saint-Lô itself, Howe is remembered for a simple, quiet promise. "See you in Saint-Lô," he said. Moments later, he was killed by a fragment of a German mortar shell. When the 29th Division fought its way into the ruined town the next day, its commander ordered that Howe be brought in with them. His body, draped in a flag, was carried on the lead vehicle and laid upon the rubble of a bombed church, and a correspondent gave him the name by which he is still remembered, the Major of Saint-Lô. The photograph of that flag-draped figure among the ruins became one of the enduring images of the campaign, and it captured something true about the price of the Hedgerows, that they were taken not by wonder weapons, but by men, one field and one life at a time. Saint-Lô fell on the 18th and 19th of July, and it gave Bradley the firm base line from which he would launch the great offensive that finally broke the deadlock. All of this, the assault teams, the tank telephone, Hill 192, the fall of Saint-Lô, had solved the problem of how to fight through the Hedgerows. But there remained a narrower mechanical problem that the demolition charges only partly answered, and that was how to get a tank through a solid earthen bank quickly, again and again, without waiting each time for engineers to place and blow explosives. And here the Army's restless tinkering produced a whole family of contraptions. Some units simply kept blowing holes in the banks with engineer demolition charges, which worked but was slow, consumed enormous quantities of explosive, and gave the German gunners on the far side ample time to re-sight their weapons on the fresh gap. Some units fitted a few of their tanks with bulldozer blades, and the tank dozer, as it was called, turned out to be genuinely useful, able to shove through a bank and to fill in the craters that bombs and shells had torn in the roads. But there were very few of them. A tank battalion might have around 70 tanks and only 3 or 4 dozers, and the Germans quickly learned to identify the conspicuous bladed vehicles and shoot them first. Other units welded heavy prongs to the front of a tank, originally meant to bore holes into the bank for demolition charges, and discovered that the prongs could sometimes lever up a section of the hedgerow enough for the tank to crash through. This device acquired the nickname of the salad fork. Elsewhere, men experimented with brush cutters and with blades of other designs. The point to hold on to is that the solution was not one man's idea. It was in the air, all along the front, because the problem was the same everywhere, and the men facing it were resourceful everywhere. But one version of the idea worked better than the others, and the story of the man usually credited with it has become, deservedly, one of the most beloved anecdotes of the war. His name was Curtis Grubb Culin, and he was a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. He was from Cranford, in New Jersey, a young man of ordinary background and no particular fame, and what he did in July of 1944 was to design a set of steel tusks that could be welded to the front of a Sherman tank. The prongs were angled so that when the tank drove into the base of an earthen bank, the tusks bit in and held the nose down rather than letting it climb. That single detail is the whole secret, and it repays a moment's thought. Every earlier attempt to get a tank through a hedgerow had wrestled with the climbing problem. Culin's tusks made climbing unnecessary. Instead of riding up over the bank and baring its belly, a tank fitted with the device drove straight into the bottom of the bank and tore a hole through it, staying level the entire time. Its armor stayed facing forward, toward the enemy. Its gun stayed horizontal, ready to fire the instant it broke through. And because it punched through the middle of the wall, rather than funneling through a gate or a lane, it could appear in places where no German expected a tank to be able to appear at all. The device did not just let tanks cross the hedgerows, it let them cross the hedgerows in unexpected places, and that unpredictability is what mattered. There is a detail in the origin of Culin's invention that has been told and retold, and honesty requires that it be handled with some care, because it sits closer to legend than to documented fact. According to the historian Max Hastings, the idea did not begin with Culin at all, but with an offhand remark during a bull session among the soldiers, a suggestion from a man Hastings describes as a Tennessee soldier named Roberts, who asked why they did not simply get some saw teeth and put them on the front of a tank to cut through the hedges. The others laughed, the story goes, but Kulin did not laugh. He saw the possibility in it, and he built it. And afterward, being an honest man, he tried to give the credit to Roberts, but by then the publicity had fixed his own name to the invention, and the correction never caught up. It is a lovely story, and it may well be true, but it rests essentially on that single account, and the honest thing to say is this. We know for certain that Kulin built and demonstrated the working device. The fuller tale of exactly where the spark came from cannot be firmly confirmed. What is not in doubt is the modesty of the man at the center of it, who by every account tried to share a credit that the world insisted on giving to him alone. What happened next moved with a speed that the slow weeks of the hedgerow fighting make almost startling. The device was shown to General Omar Bradley, the First Army commander, on the 14th of July, after another senior general had seen it and summoned him to look. Bradley watched a light tank fitted with the tusks charge a hedgerow bank at speed and burst clean through it in a shower of earth, level and gunned and ready, and he grasped the significance at once. In his own later account, he marveled that something so simple had baffled an entire army for more than 5 weeks, and he made a decision that turned one sergeant's welding job into an army-wide weapon. He ordered the cutters mass-produced, in secret, and fitted to as many tanks as possible before the great offensive he was already planning. The secrecy mattered as much as the invention. Bradley understood that the device's power lay entirely in surprise. If the Germans learned about the tusks in advance, they could adjust, thickening their defenses at the bases of the banks, re-sighting their anti-tank guns to cover the walls, and not merely the gaps. But if the first the enemy knew of it was tanks erupting through hedgerows all along the line on the same morning, the shock would multiply the effect enormously. So the work was done quietly and quickly, in the days before the offensive, and it was done with a fine and fitting irony. The steel for the tusks came, in large part, from the enemy's own beach obstacles, the great welded barriers of iron and girder that the Germans had planted along the invasion beaches to tear the bottoms out of Allied landing craft. American ordnance crews cut up those obstacles and welded them into hedgerow cutters, turning the metal of the Atlantic wall into the tool that would breach the wall of the bocage. The scale of the effort, done in something like 10 days, was considerable. Ordnance units working around the clock produced enough of the devices to equip a large fraction of the First Army's tanks. The commonly cited figure, drawn from the official histories, is that roughly 3 out of every 5 tanks in the coming attack were fitted with the cutters, on the order of 500 devices in all. In the division where the idea had taken hold, something like 3/4 of the tanks and tank destroyers received them. Extra welding equipment and crews were brought across from England to keep pace. The tanks that carried the device acquired a nickname that suited the blunt-horned snout they now wore. They were called rhinoceros tanks, and then simply rhinos. If you are finding this account worthwhile, a like helps it reach more viewers, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep dive into the parts of this war that rarely make it into the standard histories. Before we follow the rhinos into battle, we have to go 60 miles east, to the city of Caen, because the breakout in the American sector cannot be honestly explained without it. All through June and July, while the Americans bled in the hedgerows, the British and Canadian armies under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery launched a succession of heavy offensives against Caen and the open country beyond it. These operations, known by their code names, one after another through late June and into July, were brutally costly and often fell short of their ground objectives. The largest of them, launched on the 18th of July, was one of the biggest tank battles the British Army ever fought, and it cost hundreds of tanks in a few days. Critics at the time, and some since, called these battles failures, but their real effect was not measured in the ground they took. It was measured in what they pulled toward themselves. Because Caen sat on the direct road to Paris, the German High Command was convinced that the main Allied breakout, when it came, would come there, in the east, and so they fed the mass of their armor into that sector to hold it. By the last part of July, something like 6.5 panzer divisions faced the British and the Canadians in the east, while only about 1.5 faced the entire American army in the west. The German commander in the west, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, remained fixed on Caen even as the Americans massed for their own attack, certain the decisive blow would fall on his eastern flank. Whatever those bloody British battles failed to achieve on the map, they achieved the thing that mattered most. They stripped the armor away from the American front and pinned it in the wrong place. When the Americans finally struck, they would be striking at an enemy who had almost no tanks left to stop them. Even the little armor the Germans did commit against the Americans had already been spent before Cobra began. In the second week of July, the German command pulled the Panzer Lehr division across from the Caen sector and threw it into a counterattack in the American zone, hoping to cut back the ground the Americans had gained near the flooded valleys west of Saint-Lô. It was a serious effort by a serious division, but it ran headlong into American infantry and tank destroyers who broke it in a day of hard fighting and sent it reeling back with heavy losses. The counterstroke that was meant to restore the German line instead used up one of the few armored formations available in the west, and it left Panzer Lehr weakened and exposed in exactly the sector where, 2 weeks later, the sky would fall on it. The German defense of the bocage was formidable, but it had no reserve of offensive power left. It could bleed the Americans. It could not throw them back. The American offensive was called Operation Cobra, and it opened on the 25th of July, 1944. To understand what the Rhino tanks did and did not do, you have to see them in their proper place within that operation, because the honest history here is more interesting than the myth, and it matters to get it right. Cobra did not begin with the tanks. It began with the sky. Bradley concentrated the attack on a narrow strip of front west of Saint-Lô, and in front of that strip he planned one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments yet attempted in support of ground troops. There was a false start. On the 24th of July the weather closed in, and the mission was recalled after many bombers were already in the air. Some released their loads anyway through the cloud, and a portion of those bombs fell short, onto the Americans waiting below, killing about 25 men. Worse, the aborted raid warned the Germans that something was coming. The full bombardment went in the next morning, the 25th. Wave after wave of heavy and medium bombers, and the fighter bombers below them, close to 3,000 aircraft in all, poured more than 4,000 tons of bombs into a rectangle only a few thousand yards wide and deep, along the road running from Saint-Lô toward Perriers. Because the bombers flew in over the heads of the waiting American troops rather than parallel to the front line, the danger of short drops was built into the plan. Beneath that rectangle lay the Panzer Lehr division, one of the strongest German armored formations in Normandy, commanded by Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein. The bombing very nearly annihilated it. Bayerlein left an account of the experience that has become famous. The bombers, he said, came on as if on a conveyor belt, laying their carpets of explosive back and forth across his positions, until the whole landscape resembled the surface of the moon. He claimed that 70 of every 100 of his men were killed, wounded, or driven out of their senses. Historians think Bayerlein overstated those numbers, as shaken commanders often do, but no one doubts the essence of it. His division, already worn thin, was shattered as a fighting force in a single morning, and it never recovered. The bombardment's cost was not paid by the Germans alone. Once again, some of the bombs fell short onto the American lines, and this time the toll was far heavier than the day before. Roughly 111 of their own men killed, and close to 500 more wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who had gone forward to observe the attack. He was the most senior American officer killed in the entire European theater, and his death by his own side's bombs was one of the war's bitter ironies. It was a grievous loss, and it is part of the true record of that morning, which was neither clean nor simple. The first day on the ground was, by the standards of the hopes invested in it, a disappointment. The German survivors, dazed as they were, fought back, and the American advance on the 25th measured only a couple of thousand yards. But the commander of the American 7th Corps, General Joseph Collins, a driving officer his men called Lightning Joe, made a bold judgment. Sensing that the German defense was not merely dented, but broken, its command and its communications shattered by the bombing, he gambled and committed his armored divisions on the second day, rather than waiting for the infantry to fully clear the way. This was the moment the whole operation turned. On the 26th of July, the armored columns rolled forward, and this time when they met the Hedgerows did not stop them the way they had for the past 6 weeks. Some tanks tore straight through the banks with their cutters. Far more simply found that the defense which had depended on channeling them, blinding them, and slowing them had lost the men and the guns and the confidence to do any of those things. The front, which had held for so long, came apart. The collapse fed on itself. On the right of the attack, the 8th Corps joined in, pushing south. The town of Coutances fell on the 28th of July to the 4th Armored Division, in its first real action. Whole German formations, including the SS divisions that had fought so hard in the sector, were caught on the roads by American armor and air power and destroyed in a killing ground near the village of Rancé. Then came Avranches, at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, taken at the very end of July, and with Avranches, the door at the bottom of Normandy swung open. American armor began to pour through the gap into the open country beyond, where a Sherman was once again the weapon it had been designed to be. On the 1st of August, General George Patton's Third Army was activated and unleashed through that gap, and Bradley moved up to command the larger army group. The static, grinding battle of the Hedgerows had become, almost overnight, a war of movement. What followed unfolded with astonishing speed. As the American armies swung east and the British and Canadians pressed down from the north, the bulk of the German forces in Normandy were nearly trapped in a shrinking pocket of ground near the town of Falaise. Through the middle of August, that pocket was squeezed shut, and inside it the German army group in the west was largely destroyed, though a controversial decision to halt part of the encircling force allowed tens of thousands of Germans to escape eastward through a narrow gap before it finally closed. The road to the French capital now lay open, and here the campaign returns, by a strange thread, to a name we have already met. The German general who had commanded the corps in the Bocage, Dietrich von Choltitz, had by late August been made the military governor of Paris. Ordered by Hitler to burn the city to the ground rather than surrender it intact, Choltitz refused to carry out the order, and on the 25th of August he handed Paris over to the French and the Allies undestroyed. The same officer whose corps had held the Hedgerows so grimly chose in the end to spare a city. Now here is where the responsible historian has to hold two things in mind at once, and where this account will part company with the simpler versions you may have heard. It is tempting to draw a straight line and say that a sergeant's welded tusks broke the Normandy front. That is not what happened, and the men who study this most carefully have said so plainly. The official United States Army historian of the breakout judged the Hedgerow cutter to have been of little tactical value in the breakout itself, for a reason that is almost deflating in its simplicity. Once the German defense collapsed and the advance became fluid, the tanks moved fast along the roads, which were quicker than tearing through banks, and the ability to punch through a hedgerow mattered far less than it had during the grinding fight to reach the breakthrough. Later historians have gone further, listing the Rhino tanks among the cherished myths of Cobra, the comforting story of homegrown ingenuity that gets remembered while the less romantic truths quietly fade. So what actually broke the German front? Not one thing, but a convergence. The shattering weight of the air bombardment that destroyed Panzer Lehr, the massed American artillery, the overwhelming Allied command of the air, a German army bled white and starved of reserves, the absence of German armor, pinned far away at Caen, and above all the improved combined arms tactics that the American divisions had taught themselves, at bitter cost, during those weeks in the fields. The Rhino cutter was a real and clever contribution to that last category. It helped restore mobility, it lifted the spirits of men who had been trapped in the hedgerows for weeks, and in the close fighting, it did real work. But it was one enabler among many, not the cause of the victory, and the legend that grew up around it grew larger than the thing itself. There is a truer prize buried in those weeks, and it is not a device at all. The real product of the hedgerow fighting was an American army that had been forced, at brutal cost, to learn how to fight. The formations that came ashore in June were brave and well-equipped but green, and their tanks and their infantry and their engineers and their gunners had scarcely trained together as a single instrument. The Bocage was a merciless school. Field by field, at a price of tens of thousands of casualties, those separate arms welded themselves into combined teams that could take a defended hedgerow apart with method and confidence. The soldiers who broke out of Normandy at the end of July were not the same soldiers who had landed at its beginning. They had been hardened and taught by the Hedgerows, and it was this schooled and toughened army, far more than any single gadget bolted to a tank, that would drive across France in the weeks that followed and keep driving until it stood on German soil. The cutter got the headlines, the education got the war. And yet, having been scrupulous about the mechanics of the breakout, we can now return to the assumption we began with, because on that narrower and more human question, the story keeps every bit of its power. Set aside the measurable argument about how many banks were breached and how much the advance owed to the Tusks rather than the bombers. Ask instead what the mere existence of the device did to the mind of the German defender, because there the effect was real, and it is the truest sense in which the Germans stopped trusting the Hedgerows. For 6 weeks, the entire German defense of the Bocage had rested on a foundation of certainty. The defender knew where a tank could go and where it could not. He knew that the wall at his back and the wall in front of him were solid, that armor could enter his field only through the gap, the gate, or the lane, and that he had those places covered. That certainty was the thing that made the whole elastic defense possible. It let a handful of men hold a field against a company because they knew exactly which few doors they had to watch. Take away the certainty, and the entire structure loses its logic. If a tank can come through any point of any wall at any moment, then there are no doors left to watch, because the whole wall has become a door. The defender who once had 3 approaches to guard now has 100 yards of hedge to guard in every direction, and he cannot. He does not have the men. He does not have the guns. He does not, above all, have the confidence. This is the deeper thing the Rhino tanks introduced, and it is why the story endures even after the historians have trimmed its tactical claims down to size. The physical device breached a certain number of hedgerows on a certain number of days, but the idea of the device, the knowledge now planted in every German soldier's head that the bank behind which he sheltered might split open without warning, corroded something that no amount of earth and root could repair. Concealment behind a hedgerow had meaning only so long as the hedgerow was a barrier. Once it became a possible door, the man hiding behind it was no longer truly hidden. He was merely waiting, in a spot he could no longer trust, for an enemy who might now arrive from the one direction his entire training had told him was impossible. The German soldier in the Bocage had not failed. His tactics had not failed. His machine guns crossed their fire exactly as doctrine prescribed. His mortars dropped exactly where they were sighted. His defense in depth was a model of its kind, and for the better part of 2 months it had held the finest army in the world to a crawl. What failed was the assumption underneath all of it, the single unexamined premise on which the entire elegant system was balanced. The premise was that the hedgerows were walls. The Americans, without ever quite setting out to do so, had turned enough of those walls into doors that the belief itself became unusable. And once a defender can no longer trust that a wall is a wall, everything he has built on that belief comes quietly apart. There is a final irony in the fate of the man whose name is fixed to the story, and it belongs in any honest telling. Curtis Culin, who devised the cutter that let American armor tear through the hedgerow country, did not have long to enjoy his fame. A few months later, in the terrible autumn fighting in the Hürtgen forest on the German border, he stepped on a mine and lost a leg. He survived the war, came home to New Jersey, married, worked an ordinary job as a salesman, and lived quietly until his death in 1963. Years afterward, General Dwight Eisenhower, who had commanded all the Allied armies in the West, would tell Culin's story to audiences as an example of the thing he most admired about the soldiers he had led. Here was an ordinary man in the ranks who looked at an impossible problem and simply solved it, without waiting for anyone above him to grant permission. That, in the end, may be the part of the story that best deserves to survive the pruning of the historians. Not the inflated claim that a piece of welded steel won a battle, but the smaller and sturdier truth about where the idea came from. Because the deepest contrast in this whole account is not between two kinds of tank or two kinds of terrain, it is between two habits of mind, and it would be wrong and unfair to the German soldier to draw it as a simple matter of a rigid army against a free one. German doctrine did not despise initiative, it prized it. It pushed decisions downward, trusted its junior officers and its sergeants to act on their own judgment, and produced some of the finest small unit leadership of the entire war. The German defender in the bocage was no mindless cog waiting for orders. He improvised constantly, and he improvised brilliantly. The difference lay somewhere more specific than courage or cleverness. The German genius was tactical. It was the art of fighting the battle in front of you superbly, with whatever you had in your hands. The American genius, in this particular campaign, was for changing the tools of the battle itself, and then for spreading a good idea from one welding shop to 500 tanks in the space of 10 days. One army was magnificent at playing the game as it found it. The other had a restless, empirical, almost industrial habit of asking whether the rules of the game could be rewritten, and then rewriting them at factory speed. Both produced brave and skilled men. But the German defense of the bocage rested, at the very bottom, on one assumption about the ground that no one had thought to test, and the American army happened to be the kind of organization that tested assumptions for a living. Return, then, to that machine gunner in the opening field, the figure who stood in for so many thousands of real men holding those banks. He would have died believing that a tank could not pass through the wall in front of him, because everything in his experience and his training had told him so, and he had no way to know that a young sergeant from New Jersey had, a few days earlier and a few miles away, quietly begun to make that belief obsolete. He was not beaten by braver soldiers. He was not beaten, in the end, even by a better machine. He was beaten by a better question, asked by an army in the habit of asking it, and that, far more than any welded steel, is why the Germans stopped trusting the Hedgerows. If this account gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. It is how stories like this one reach the people who care about the history behind the history.